When you enter the Cape Breton Highlands National Park on the Cheticamp side, one of the first trails you'll encounter is Acadian. Now, this trail is a nod to the Acadian people who live in this area, as well as the Acadians who once lived on the side of this mountain. Over roughly 9 kilometers, I'll be climbing 365 meters. And it's here that I'm on my walkabout today. This is a Parks Canada trail and not intended as a backcountry trail, so that means it's well maintained. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Park staff have installed benches along the way, so you can take your time as you climb. The name of the trail may be a nod to those who lived here, and in fact still live here in nearby Cheticamp. But it could also refer to the type of forest found, the Acadian forest. Here, the Acadian forest is a transition area of sorts between soft and hardwoods. In Cape Breton, yellow birch, American beech, balsam fir, and eastern hemlock are among the most commonly found species. You know, this forest has all kinds of different plants and animals. And especially if you look, you can see the shade-tolerant plants and shrubs and lichens, mosses growing on the forest floor. And you'll see the small specimens of trees, like this. They're just waiting for their moment to take off, because there's trees in this forest that can be hundreds of years old. And these small saplings, they just wait, and when the sky opens up and allows them their opportunity, they soar. This is a mature forest, but it isn't old growth. Despite the fact the natural environment has taken over, these lands were forested by those who lived along these slopes until less than a century ago. In Nova Scotia, old-growth forests are those which are generally over 125 years old and have a mixed canopy of different species. Lots of large woody debris on the forest floor and an ecosystem that is well developed to replace mature trees as they fall or die. This stream that I've been following as I make my way up this side of the hike is called Ruisseau des Habitations Neuves, which roughly translates to Stream of New Homes. The name is somewhat literal because before the park was created in the 1930s, Acadians called this area home. Well, only 10% of the forest in the Cape Breton Highlands National Park is Acadian forest. Most of it is actually Boreal or taiga. Now, taiga is a Russian word which refers to forests at the highest latitudes. It's sometimes also called the snow forest. The words Boreal and taiga are used interchangeably, including here in the park. And they do overlap for certain. But maps of the Cape Breton Highlands will actually show taiga forest at the very highest altitudes and Boreal elsewhere. Regardless, Boreal forests are one of the most important biomes in the world, making up 11% of the Earth. The Boreal forest is comprised of somewhat different species than the Acadian forest. Balsam fir and white birch are the most commonly found, interspersed with smaller concentrations of white and black spruce. There are fewer plant species in the Boreal forest compared to the Acadian forest, largely due to the harsher climate conditions and often the elevation. Acidic soils make it much more difficult for shrubs to grow, so you don't see the same lush, dense plant coverage at the forest floor. Instead, you see smaller plants like wild lily of the valley bunchberry and sphagnum moss. Unlike the century or more old trees in the Acadian forest, trees in the Boreal forest rarely live beyond 100 years, and often much shorter lifespans. Well, back in the 1970s and 80s, This forest was hard hit by a spruce budworm outbreak. And the balsam fir here were particularly hard hit. Now, what normally happens after an insect infestation or a forest fire is first the ferns will grow up, then the birch will quickly take over and secure the ground, and finally, the fir trees grow, which creates a natural forest. But that's not what happened here. The balsam fir had a devious predator, moose. By the 1980s, there were a lot of moose in this park. And because moose like young fir trees, the natural regeneration of the boreal forest has stalled. Park staff estimate the moose eat anywhere from 50 to 60% of the balsam fir. Moose and black bear. They are fairly common in this area of the park and are seen on this trail, to the point where Parks Canada staff actually remind people to be watchful for these animals that call this park home. Now, while they are probably the largest mammals you will find in the Cape Breton Highlands, they are by no means the only animals that call this area home. The Highlands are home to snowshoe hare, red fox, lynx, American marten, bobcat, and all manner of mouse and related species. On a trail like this, which includes forest, but also runs along the coast, you can encounter or see on different sections of the trail a wide variety of bird species, including eagles, harriers, Swainson thrush, white-throated sparrow, and more than 18 species of warbler. Parks Canada puts these red chairs on trails across the country. And every time I come upon one, I think about the effort it must take to bring one up here and install it, but they are lovely additions. Well, I've reached the top of Acadian. After the break, I'll be headed down along the coastal side of this trail. But for now, I'm going to take in the view. I'm on Acadian Trail in the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. Now, I've passed the high point and I'm working my way down the coastal side of this trail. Out here, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, if I head northeast, I'll hit the Cabot Strait past northern Cape Breton. If I go southwest, Prince Edward Island. Now, Prince Edward Island is 85 kilometers from here, and the Magdalen Islands, 85 kilometers that way. This trail essentially sits between two mountains, Black Mountain down closer to Cheticamp on the other side of the Cheticamp River, and the Pinnacle, which is inland, east of here. The Pinnacle is the second highest point in Nova Scotia with an elevation of 530 meters. Now, Nova Scotia is divided into a number of what are known as eco-districts. This is the Cape Breton Highlands Eco-District. The majority of the eco-district sits at an elevation of more than 300 meters above sea level. The district is in turn part of what is known as the Cape Breton Highlands eco-region, which extends from the Cabot Strait to the mountains east of Lake Ainslie. What is particularly special, and is in large part credited to the creation of the national park here, is that the eco-district is an almost unbroken forest that includes headwaters to the major rivers such as the Margaree, Aspy, and Bedeque. These rivers carry a lot of water, thanks in part to the cold late springs and heavy snowfalls. Of all the eco-districts in the province, this is the one that has the most protected land. In fact, 94% of all the land in this eco-district is owned by either the federal or provincial government. The rest is either privately held or owned by associations. These highlands are very old mountains. If you look at them from the air, they have flat, rounded tops instead of peaks. Many of the mountains here have multiple summits rather than a single summit. This is because the mountains have been worn down over time. This part of Cape Breton is made up of sedimentary and volcanic rock that formed off the northwest coast of the continent we now call South America. This part of Cape Breton is known by geologists as the Breton terrain. 700 million years ago, a supercontinent called Rodinia broke up. Sedimentary rocks, or rocks which are layered, were formed in the seas off a new continent called Amazonia. They merged with volcanic igneous rock and formed the Breton terrain. This was a period of hundreds of millions of years of violent geological change. Over time, about 500 million years ago, one of the new seas closed and brought together a new area called Gondwana, which merged with the Avalon terrain. While what we now know as Cape Breton would not entirely be formed for another 100 to 200 million years, the merging of these two land masses created much of what we recognize today as industrial Cape Breton and the Highlands, separated by the Breton Lakes. This side of the trail is really all about the views. You know, from here, you're obviously looking down the coast of Cape Breton. That's Cheticamp Island. And down you can just make out the steeple of St. Pierre Church. Coming down this side of the trail, the vegetation, just like the views, are very different. Coming up, I came through a valley of sorts, transitioning from Acadian forest to Boreal to an almost savanna-like experience at the summit. This side of the slope is pounded by the winds and weather coming off the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so the flora has to be a lot more resilient. And while it's a bit windy today, it's nothing compared to what this region sometimes sees. Les Souhaits are infamous winds along this coast. The term is an Acadian French contraction used in Cheticamp, which means southeast. They are strong and they are cold. A weather station near here has recorded wind speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour on numerous occasions. That's as strong as a Category 3 hurricane. The winds themselves are the result of the southeast wind lifting off the other side of Cape Breton Island and flowing across the plateaus, those rounded mountaintops I spoke of earlier. The plateaus in Cape Breton are subject to periodic temperature inversions where warm air sits above the colder air. The winds coming across are compressed by the temperature gradient and speed up, racing down this side of the highlands and to the ocean. Behind me is Cheticamp. Now, Cheticamp is considered one of the world's Acadian capitals. It was settled in 1752, at least by Europeans, by a man named Charles Robin, who was a merchant from the French island of Jersey. By 1776, he had 14 Acadian fishermen who were working in the area, and his businesses were the biggest economic driver in this region. But despite that, all of those employees and all of those European settlers were only seasonal residents. The first permanent French settlers were Pierre Bois and Joseph Richard in 1782. Many of the surnames of those original French settlers are the names still most common today. Now, the name Cheticamp, like so many places in Nova Scotia, actually originates with the Mi'kmaq. The name started with Ajutwa, which means rarely full, a reference to the dune that once appeared at the mouth of Cheticamp Harbor at low tide. The French interpretation of that word would change dramatically over time, from Oshitasia in the 1660s, then morphing into Cheticamp, and by 1803, Cheticamp. It wasn't actually until 1815 that the current spelling was formalized. But even then, the pronunciation varied from versions like Le Chady, Le Grand Chady, until the current Cheticamp. Though even that isn't used often. More often now you hear an English version of the name, Cheticamp. This is an incredibly popular trail, and that's no surprise. There are 3 distinct ecosystems here. There's the valley and its forest and the river. There's the plateau with the grasses and the barren. And there's this side, the coastal side of this trail. and the spectacular views that you get from the coastal side of the trail. It's unbelievable. You know, early on in this hike, I talked about the river and how it was named to remember, in many respects, the Acadians that once called this area home. Well, across the highway, there's another trail, Labut, which remembers the Acadians who once farmed, fished, and called this area home.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
Just up the road from the Acadian Trail, but still in Cape Breton Highlands National Park, you'll find a short loop of under 2 kilometers where you can have an easy stroll and enjoy the breezes coming off the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Called interchangeably Labut Trail or Labut Path, this is where I'm on my walkabout today. While just a short loop, this trail tells an important story about the Acadians who once lived here not long ago, before this land was a national park. The trail going out follows what was once a cart path between Cheticamp and Labut. The name Buttereau comes from Petit Bout, which is French for small hill. And that's exactly what this area is, a small hill overlooking the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Cheticamp River. In the 1930s, Labut was one of 8 small hamlets that made up the district of Cap Rouge. They were settled sometime in the early 1800s. Many of these small Acadian communities in this area were ultimately expropriated and evacuated to create the national park between 1936 and 1939. The district of Cap Rouge covered an area roughly 7 miles to the north of Cheticamp. It included many different hamlets, including Labut, Rousseau des Maurice, or Trout Brook, Cheticamp River Valley, Presqu'île, Rivière à Lazare, or Corny Brook, and Rousseau du Kennedy. Those communities are all gone now. Many are memorialized with trails in this park. These days, Cap Rouge is not so much a district, but rather a name used to refer to the collection of communities which were expropriated to create the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. The remains of the homes that you see along this trail are, for the most part, those of the last 5 families that remained here in 1936. Now, these homes were not very big, but the families sure were. Of those 5 families, all of them comprised of at least 2 adults and between 9 and 11 children. Each family had a house and a barn. The homes here were not extravagant. A kitchen, dining room, and bedrooms. A wood stove likely in the center of the house would have provided the heat. Now, when it came to deciding how to create the Cape Breton Highlands National Park, these communities posed a quandary. These were small communities of 10 or fewer families up and down parts of the coast. And without their land, it would have made it impossible to have a park which included access to the ocean. There was a school, a post office, and other amenities spread out along the coast. One report noted just 2 homes over a length of 5 miles in one area. There were so many isolated and small communities north of Cheticamp that eventually expropriation was chosen as a way to get the park designated. From this point, I can choose between 2 directions. I'm taking the shorter Buttereau loop, which will take me down towards the coast, but I could also take Le Chemin de Buttereau, which continues to follow the old cart path towards Cheticamp. That's about 4.5 kilometers return, or 6 kilometers if you include the Buttereau loop. The trail continues past additional foundations of settlers, through Acadian forest and along former pasture land. That old cart path was really the primary overland route from Cheticamp to the many hamlets like Labut from the 1700s until the Cabot Trail was ultimately opened in the 1930s. Well, this is the mouth of the Cheticamp River, and it flows down from the Cheticamp Flowage, which is a lake on the Cheticamp Flats. Now, that's outside of the national park boundaries. That lake is more or less halfway between here and Cape Smoky, which is on the other side of the Highlands. Crossing the river would have been a seasonal challenge for residents here. The highway that now exists wasn't there when this community was active. Residents did not have cars. They walked the almost 8 kilometers to the center of town for things like Sunday church. Now in the winter, residents crossed the river by walking on the ice. In the summer, they would try to get a boat, which could take them further into town. As for the children going to school, well, they sometimes managed to hitch a ride in the back of a truck from Cheticamp once road construction began and rudimentary bridges were constructed. Day-to-day life here was largely the responsibility of women. Almost all the men fished, and they took one day off a week once fishing season began in spring, Sunday. For the rest of the week, the men would live in fishing shacks away from here. Fishing would start with the spring lobster and move on to various species until the ice moved into the bay. Lobster in those days went for 50 cents. Not for one lobster, but for 100 lobsters. By contrast, this year lobster hit $17.15 a pound at the wharf. That was high. But even so, wharf prices of $10 or $11 are not uncommon. A far cry from the penny days. They would have also experienced the harsh winters that can sometimes be a part of life here. It would not have been an easy life after all. One report on the expropriation said these may have been the happiest Canadians at the time of the Great Depression. The economy hasn't changed a lot in the region over the past 100 years. Fisheries are still a primary driver here, though tourism, especially with the introduction of the national park, has grown substantially. This is now a year-round gateway to the Highlands. The Acadians who lived here lived with a sense of contentment and disconnectedness from the wider world. That report I talked about said that they were less affected by the Depression over the last 5 years than other Canadians. Maybe there's something to be said about being disconnected from the wider world by a cart path. Well, I hope your next walkabout allows you to disconnect.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine. Oh, hey. Oh, hey. Oh, hey. Feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.